Welcome to the show. My guest today is Andrew Pariser, Vice President of the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, RESCON, where he spends a lot of time on labor relations, negotiating deals, agreements among groups of people with different needs and goals. He has negotiated in boardrooms, small businesses, restaurants, even in front of hotels on the sidewalk. Not only is Andrew a labor relations expert in practice, he's also has a master's in industrial relations from Queen's University. And I'm excited to talk with him about negotiating. Andrew, there's a saying about negotiation that goes, whoever speaks first loses. How do you feel about that?
Well, first off, thanks for having me and congratulations on a great first season. Just big fan of the podcast. As far as the question, I'll give you a one-word answer and then I'll dive into some of the details. So first blush, absolutely, but only if you believe it. So self-confidence is important and confidence in general is important when you're negotiating. And so if you think you're going to lose out of the gate, by something as simple as talking first, you certainly will.
So how does knowing how to negotiate help someone in their everyday life?
So negotiations, when you think about it, is part of everyday life, and you're constantly negotiating. You're negotiating with your friends, your family, your work colleagues, your boss, anybody. Some negotiations are either easier than others and some are set. When you go to the store, in theory, you're entering into a negotiation to determine how much you're going to pay for those groceries. That one's pretty straightforward. You either kind of pay the price or you don't, but that isn't consistent across all goods and it isn't consistent in all jurisdictions and countries. You negotiate, if you're a family who's going to drop the kids off at daycare or what you're going to have for dinner. You negotiate with, in your workplace, who does what task and when is it going to get completed and when is it going to get completed. So for me, negotiations is part of, everyone's daily activity.
Right. And of course, you in your profession work with different groups and organizations. I've heard this other phrase, which is, and I like it a lot, is it's negotiation, means ultimately everyone leaves the table feeling like they got the biggest slice of the pie. And I think that can be summarized as, a feeling of win-win. Is that realistic in win-win being the ultimate goal of a negotiation?
Yeah, and I think now you're getting into different types of negotiations. And so thinking back to when I was at Queen's University and my professors there, there's two main types of negotiations. One is distributive and one is integrative. And so integrative is more of the win-win. And that's the idea of you want to grow the pie as big as possible. And that's your classic win-win. Whereas distributive one is the pie is set. And you can only cut it so many different ways. So classic examples for anyone who's done some negotiating kind of simulations. There's a famous one involving an orange, and it involves two groups of scientists or two scientists, and essentially one needs the peel and the seeds, and the other one needs the flesh and the juice. And so you see how they can come to a win-win. The other example is the car dealership, right? Whatever you pay the car dealer is coming out of your pocket. It's very hard to create a win-win in that situation. And so there's different types of negotiations and you can't always have win-win, but that's I think where it comes from.
And how about preparation? How important is that in negotiating? I mean, I tend to overthink things. For anyone who's listening right now, if you go to Job Talks, or rather youtube.com/Job Talks podcast, you're going to see Andrew and I talking, and I'm kind of wearing a flowery shirt underneath my sports coat, and I might overthink that and be wondering whether or not I should even be wearing such attire when going into a negotiation. What things should people be thinking about, clothing being one of them or not, when going into a serious negotiation?
Yeah, I think it's actually a great example. And negotiations, it can be very personal, right? So there's no right way to negotiate, but there's lots of wrong ways. So if you've got, a power suit or a power tie or a power shirt or something that gives you confidence, then you should certainly wear it. Clothing is not something that I'm overly interested in. And so as long as I'm one, professional and two, comfortable, that's about as much as I'm going to think about it. preparation to me is the key. And I guess I say that I got into this area probably a little bit younger than most people. In some ways, I started my career backwards. I actually started my career as an intern in mediation. And so oftentimes people get into mediation after having a successful career, either with an employer, with the union, negotiating collective agreements. And so one way that I was able to overcome my inexperience was through, I wouldn't say excessive, but definitely fulsome preparation. So I made sure I knew the parties, I knew the issues, and I was ready to go as much as I could. Preparation, though, is an individual thing. You've got to be in a place where you can be authentically you, right? Again, there's no right way to negotiate, but there's lots of wrong ways. So,
and how about timing? I mean, anyone who's watched a movie, when it came down to a big negotiation or TV series, it's usually at that last 10 minutes when something actually gets done. Or is that just the movies, or is that similar to what happens in real life? That last half an hour, and say something about the importance of setting a, I guess I would call it a work back date and time. How important is that in a formal negotiation?
Yeah, there's a couple things that go into that. I think urgency is kind of what you're getting into. So when I look at a negotiation, there's obviously certain phases. And so certainly some of the phases are kind of preparation, but then also information gathering. So at the start of the negotiation, you need to gather as much information as you can on the situation on the other side, and what a potential settlement could look like for you and the other side. A term that's very important in negotiations is BATNA. So what that means is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? You need to determine what happens if you don't get a deal, right? All of that builds information and helps you get towards a deal. One thing I'll say, and I'm sure this is going to come up later, you can't make a deal with someone who's not ready. So if someone is still gathering information, don't make a settlement offer or don't give your best offer, because they're not going to be ready for it. And if they're not ready for it, you're not going to reach a deal. Bargaining is one of the few things you can't do by yourself. So, just like anything with a partner, you have to be in tune with their timing, and hopefully they're in tune with your timing.
And how about this idea of home court advantage? We see this in television and movies, when the company, the corporation, it's their home court advantage, and they set the temperature of the room, whether it's extremely hot, extremely cold. They arrange the furniture in the way that they want to give them some kind of an advantage in that negotiation. Is that real life? Does that happen in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And to get back to a previous comment you made, the movies reflect real life, and real life reflects the movies, right? So when you get a good negotiation movie, sure, everyone who negotiates, you recreate what you see in the movies, right? And I've seen lots of tricks, and yes, they often involve the thermostat or the location of the table. I remember one negotiation where every time, I think it was the employer group left, the union moved the table a little bit closer to them. And so as the day went on, they literally felt, their backs up against the wall.
Wow.
So it gets into, negotiations, it's ebb and flows, it's a relationship, and you're trying to impact that, right? You're trying to make the other side uncomfortable. You're trying to appear strong to the other side. When it gets into home court, I'm not too picky. I'll negotiate anywhere. I used to be a mediator. I traveled the province. I'd negotiate in small business offices, in restaurants, a bakery at 6 o'clock in the morning, in front of a hotel. To me, it doesn't much matter. But situationally, if I know I need information from the other side, I might want to meet at their office, because then the information is available to them. It's easier for them to give it to me. I've met employers and unions that really do prefer the home court, and that's where they're comfortable. So when it comes to making a deal, you want to be comfortable, because you want to be able to, think rationally and calmly when you're making your final decisions.
So can anyone learn to negotiate? I'm thinking, obviously it's a skill. You get better at it. Every time you try, learn from your mistakes. But is it also something that you can only get so far, but you need that sort of special ingredient, that special spark that only certain people have? And related to that, what are some mistakes that you might see when people maybe are getting a bit ahead of themselves and thinking they're an expert negotiator when clearly they've got a lot to learn?
Yeah, I think the truth is, pretty much everybody can get better at everything, whether it's sports, education, learning to speak a language. But no, I wouldn't recommend that everybody get into negotiations. I think I also wouldn't, recommend everyone become a French teacher or an airplane pilot or different things like that. I think you can improve your abilities, but certain people just won't have that skill set, right? And I think that becomes obvious when you look at some of the most common mistakes. One that jumps out at me is you can't please everybody, right? And so part of the prep is having very set and defined goals, because you need to know what you're negotiating for, right? And if you don't know what your goal is, it's hard to be successful. Another one for me as a mediator, before I joined RESCON, you're viewed as the steward of the process, right? So the collective agreement belongs to the parties, the employers and the unions. The process belongs to the mediators, right? And so I focus heavily on the process. And what that means, and one common mistake, is negotiating with yourself. And so something that's very common is someone will make an offer and then they'll run and they'll make a second offer before anyone's had a chance to respond. Well, when you make an offer, stop, right? Don't make another offer. Worst thing that happens is they're going to come back with an offer as a counter, or they might actually even accept it, but they won't do that if you don't give them time, right? And so that's two big issues that you really need to avoid. You got to trust the process and you got to allow for it.
For sure. And that also comes back to that point of how not everyone can do it. If you're wired in a way when you're trying to please everybody or you're impatient, right? Or you get nervous, and these are qualities that you can't get over, maybe stay away from that particular career journey. And
one thing that I love that I got to throw in there's a phrase called fullness of time. And where that comes in is someone will say, well, how long will it take for the other side to respond, right? It'll take the fullness of time. And what that means is no one has any idea, right? But you've got to be patient if you're going to be a negotiator. It can't be rushed. It's a science and an art, if I can say that.
Yeah. Can you say a little more about anything that if someone wants to learn a bit more about negotiation that they might not find in a Google search, some tips that you might not read about? It's just things that are whispered in the hallways that, the one about, you probably wouldn't do it, but, pushing the boardroom table is really interesting. You probably wouldn't see that through Googling it, but anything that's, come to you is fascinating that you're willing to share?
Yeah, I think when you have to give a lot of credit to the research that's available out there, I think it's come a long way. Stuff that's less common that people wouldn't think about, I would say, is the human factor. When you're looking at being successful at anything, it all starts with good foundations, right? And so what people don't realize is negotiations isn't a time to try new things. And I think people often will because it's a new experience. And when you're having a new experience, you're open to different things. And some specific examples: if you drink 1 cup of coffee a day, don't drink 10, right? Don't pick, a hotel where you're going to stay up for 24 hours straight to be the time that you try new food, right? And so there's some very basic things that make you successful in every other part of your life. They certainly apply. I think integrity is also a big one. And so, I think at the end of the day, with the table example, there was a long-standing relationship there, so everybody had a good chuckle. But you certainly wouldn't want to do anything that would compromise your integrity, because most negotiations happen over a very long period of time, and the rapport and your credibility, it's not something you want to joke around with, because it's very easy to lose and it's almost impossible to regain.
I think that's great advice. There's another area where I know all our listeners and viewers will be able to relate to this negotiation practice of one's salary. And I can speak to that as having not done a great job or any job in the past. I certainly can remember times one of the first big jobs that I was offered the job by phone. They said, the salary is blank. Do you accept? And I went, yes. And then certainly, 2 weeks later, you start the job, and the months go by, and you start whispering, and you start noticing that there are a lot of people doing the same thing that you're doing who are getting paid more. And then there was a few years later, another job. Do you accept? This is the salary. Do you accept? Yes. And what would you say to me, or any new worker who's in that position? How do you go about that process of getting over that discomfort of having to negotiate your salary?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is always ask for a little bit of time. Mm-hmm. So you get a job offer. Thank you so much. I just want to talk this over with someone, whether it's a partner, a spouse, your parents, whoever. No employer, generally speaking, has been in such a rush that they can't give you at least a little bit of time, whether it's just a day, right? Then I think, step back, get back to the prep, analyze your situation. So my first job was with the government. So the government is not a very flexible place, and I don't say that to be rude. They have salary grids there. So somebody, in their compensation department said, this intern in this area will get paid this. So the truth is, I didn't have any ability to negotiate my first, wage, right? So it's not something you have to worry about. You take it or you leave it. Alternatively, I work in a unionized work environment where I negotiate in a unionized work environment. If you're part of a collective agreement, that's literally what the union's there for. It's their job to negotiate the terms and conditions of employment, including salary. So you probably won't have an ability to negotiate there. If I'm looking to negotiate a raise, I think you have to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So if I'm going to go to my boss who has to report to, another boss or a board or somebody else, what information does that person need to be on my team, right? And also, when's the best time for them to ask? So if you have a budget period from July to July, don't go and ask for a raise in August, because I can't think of one boss or manager that's going to go to their boss or their board right after they've had the budgets approved and say, oh, by the way, I think John's been doing a really great job, and I think he needs some more money. The board's going to say, well, where was this in June if he was doing such a great job, right? And so I think understanding the timing and how decisions are made is great. To get more information, do you know anyone else doing the job, right? Can you get comparable salaries? Is it something that, it's in a field? So especially entry-level positions, it's not specialized. It's not at just one company. So if you can understand the salary range, that certainly helps. But standing up, asking questions, those are all great tips.
I think that's great. And I'm hearing something you said earlier. It's all about preparation, right? So not just preparing for that interview, but preparing to get offered the job, and allowing for that time. That's great advice. And I don't think a lot of people think about that. I don't think they think of the budgetary cycle and necessarily putting themselves in other people's shoes. They obviously think about their own needs first. So I think many people are going to appreciate hearing that. Related to that is negotiating with someone who has more power than you. Is that something that has ever set you back, or you've seen that be a barrier, or has more of your activities been in a group setting where maybe there was not a David and Goliath type of scenario?
Yeah, I think everybody has power. It's an absolute, but it's also a relative term. Even in an extreme situation, let's say you applied to a job, right? And you're interviewing with a director who gets to pick anybody. At some point, though, they've made you an offer, right? And that director has given you some power by making you an offer, right? And so it gets back to the timing. Power, it ebbs and flows, right? So it's something that you need to be aware of, but you also need to pick your times. You obviously want to make a deal when you have more or the most power, right?
Yeah.
And so if you feel powerless, you might have less power than somebody, but it doesn't mean that you're powerless. I think it also goes into what's your negotiation plan. One thing that I guess would frustrate me is when people pursue a path or a plan that even if they execute it perfectly, won't get them what they want. And to me, that's just silly, right? So I think going back and setting clear goals helps you analyze the power structure, helps you analyze, what you may or may not be able to do, and don't worry about the things you can't change, right?
Right.
So if you're an entry-level employee, you can't be a director, right? That's not how it works. But you do still have power in the fact that an offer, potentially will be made to you. And then at that point, yes, you do have a little bit of power. So understanding, again, the timing, the flow, and setting good goals, it's all ways to address the power situation.
And just wrapping up, Andrew, it's the times we're in right now. Canada, in relation to vaccines and other considerations, it's never been more important to be in a position of strong negotiating power, especially when there's so much competition for limited supply. I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position, but can you say, can you give me your take on how things are going right now? What might we do better in the future to, increase the public's confidence? I'm not sure where it is right now, but could always go better in terms of how Canada's responding to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, I think a couple points jump out. So one, if you're not in the negotiating room, it's hard to get a clear picture of what's going on. So I'll make some guesses. My guess is when all the vaccine talks started, we didn't have a lot of information. So, if the pandemic was announced last March, I don't know when the government of Canada would have had to start, negotiating with Pfizer and some of the other vaccine providers. But I'm sure they would have liked more information. And I think, it's very impressive how effective these vaccines are. And so clearly, 9 months later, the right answer would have been give the companies as much money as you can to get as many vaccines as quickly as you can, right? But we didn't know, or they didn't know, in the spring of last year, if these vaccines would have worked. And I guess, if you're in that room, one side says, okay, we got to do everything we can to get vaccines. The other side is, well, we have to be prudent and to waste, or spend $2 billion on a vaccine if we don't know if it's going to work. That is a tough negotiation. And I think it also raises another key point. Oftentimes the negotiation in your own room is way tougher than will ever be in somebody else's room. And I think that applies to political parties, but also in collective bargaining, when you're sitting in an employer's room or when you're sitting in the union room, right? Think about some of the negotiations you've had with your family or your friends, right? Those are some of the tensest and toughest negotiations. So I guess in hindsight, some countries have done a lot better than Canada. And I assume it was because they either got, deals put in place a lot sooner than we did, or maybe even days sooner, or, they agreed to more favorable terms. You don't really know until it's too late if your approach is right. And I think that's where you go back to it. A big part of negotiations is actually using the negotiations to gather information.
Andrew Pariser, it's awesome getting to talk with an expert. So grateful for you to spend time with us today.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on. And it's a pleasure to be included with the caliber of your other guests. And, just the pleasure's all mine. And thank you so much and for all the good work that you do as well.
Thanks, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.